Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b of Maseches Kiddushin, and we are about 8 lines down the page at the 2 dots where it says V'hanirtza nikna biritzia. So this is actually referencing back to the Mishnah on Daf Yudal Amud Beis 14b, and the end of the Mishnah had said that a nirtza, a Jewish slave who decided he was going to stay on past the end of his 6-year term, who gets his ear pierced. Nirtza means the one who was pierced. So it says that how is he acquired to the master? He's acquired by nirtza nikna biritzia. He's acquired through the act of piercing his ear. That's how he now becomes the property of the owner, at least until Yovel. So the Gemara brings the source for that, Tifsiv, because the pasuk says, it says in that pasuk, in Parshas Mishpatim, it says that the master will pierce his ear, and he'll serve him forever, meaning until Yovel. He'll serve him until Yovel. So that's how he's acquired, through the piercing of the ear. Now the Mishnah then said, he acquires himself back in 2 ways, either when Yovel comes, he goes free, or b'misas ha'adon, when the master dies, he does not get inherited by the children, rather he goes free when the master dies. D'chsiv, as the pasuk says, va'avado, and he will serve him, meaning he'll serve the master, v'lo es haben, v'lo es habas, but not the son or the daughter. He does not go on as an inheritance at this point when he's a nirtza, when he passes the 6 years. Within the 6 years, he does go on as an inheritance until the 6-year term expires, but after the 6 years, if he's a nirtza, if he stayed on longer by having his ear pierced, he doesn't, and then the master dies, he doesn't get inherited, he goes free. And also it says li'olam, he'll serve li'olam, forever, but forever doesn't mean forever. Li'olamo shel Yovel, for the period until Yovel, that we know, because the psukim that talk about Yovel say that everybody goes free. So he goes free at Yovel, but he serves li'olam until olamo shel Yovel, until the time of Yovel of the Jubilee. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. So now we're going to talk about the halachos that relate to having his ear pierced so he stays on for a longer term. Martzeya. It says that he gets it pierced with a martzeya. Martzeya is an awl. It's a metal peg that's meant for poking holes in things. So ainli ala martzeya. I only know that it works if he had it done with an awl. Minayin l'rabos hasol v'hasira v'hamachat v'hamekadech v'hamechtav. How do I know that it would be true even with these other forms, these other pointy objects? What are these things? So a sol, Rashi tells us elsewhere, here Rashi just tells us it's broka. But elsewhere he tells us in Shavuos that it means a sharp wood piece, a sharp wood stick of some sort. A sira is a thorn. A machat is a needle made of metal. A makdeach is some kind of like drill bit, wherever they had in those days. And a michta from the root kosev, it was a writing implement of sharp metal to, I guess, carve letters into something. So what about all these other types of sharp objects? What if you don't use the classic awl to make the hole, but rather you use one of these other objects? That was the question that was posed, or that was what the Brisa says. How do I know that works too? Talmud Lomar, because the Torah says v'lakachta, and you should take. It says in the pasuk there, and you should take the awl and you should put it in his ear. But why does it have to tell you to take it? So that's extra. It's telling you l'rabos kol davar shnikach biyad, that you can use anything that you take with your hand. Any implement that you could hold in your hand to poke the hole could work. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Omer, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, Ma martzeam yuchad shal mateches, that no, there's somewhat of a limitation, just like the martzeya, the awl, is made of metal, af kol shal mateches, so too anything else that's made of metal you could use, but you couldn't use like a thorn or a wood stick. those would be excluded, but some of these examples like the metal needle or the writing implement, which is made of metal, those would be included according to Rabbi. Now the Gemara will later the Gemara is not quoting a whole brisa, it's going to break it down. So it will tell us what exactly they're arguing over, what is it, what's the root of this argument between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi that's leading them to express their opinions. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda saying it could be anything, and Rabbi saying, or at least it could be anything that you take in your hand, and Rabbi saying it has to be made of metal. So that the Gemara will get to later. The brisa continues though, and it says, Davar Acher, another idea, Hamartzeya. The pasuk says that he takes the martzeya, the all. So that the is like the martzeya. Lahavi hamartzeya hagadol. That's to bring that it can be or it must be. It's not so clear. Even a big all. It's not limited to a regular all, but even a big all, or perhaps it must be a big all. That's what ha-martzeya says, the martzeya, the big one. Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Yudan beribi, Yudan, who was this very wise person, hayadare, she would teach the following, kishein rotzayim, when they pierce the ear, in rotzayim ela b'milsa, or b'milas, he's telling you, where do they pierce? They pierce the earlobe. The soft part of the ear, that's where the piercing goes. That's the opinion of Yudan Beribi. The Chachamim, but the Chachamim say, Ein Evet Ivri Kohen Nirtza. The Chachamim say that it can't be that you pierce the ear, because we know they say that an Evet Ivri who's a Kohen, if a Kohen became a slave, a Jewish slave, and he wants to stay on past the 6 years, they say he can't. Why? Because it will make him blemished and it will render him unfit to serve in the Beis HaMikdash if he has a blemish by having a hole through his ear. V'im tomar b'milsa himrotzayim, and say the Chachamim, we know that that's the halacha, and if you'll tell me that they're piercing through the earlobe, heich eved ivri kohen yaseh balmum. How would that make him into a balmum? Having a hole in your earlobe does not make you into a balmum. Ha'eng nirtza. So that doesn't make you a balmum. That doesn't make you blemished. A Kohen who has an earring, has a piercing in his earlobe, that's fine. So what do we see? Say the Chachamim, ha'eng nirtza begova shel ozen. It must be that from the fact that the halacha is like a Kohen can't be nirtza, can't have his ear pierced for staying on. It must be that piercing is not just in the lobe, because that would not render the Kohen a balmum, a blemished Kohen. Rather, the piercing must be higher up in the ear, on the ear, in the cartilage. That's where it's a problem. That's the opinion of the Chacham. So again, Yudan Berivi said that the piercing is in the earlobe, and the Chacham say that can't be because we know a Kohen is not allowed to get this because it'll make him blemished, and that doesn't make you blemished. So it must be that the piercing is higher up in the ear. Okay, now we're going to break down the brisa. So the Gemara says, "B'maikom iflagi, b'maikom ipalgi." What are they arguing about? It's going back to the first argument where Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda said that you can use anything that you hold in your hand to make the piercing, and Rabbi said it has to be metal. So the Gemara explains, "The Rabbi darish klali uprati," because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi darshins, he uses the methodology of deriving from the Torah of klal uprat, of generalizations followed by specifications and the rules that apply to that, as follows. V'lokachta klal. That the Torah says, and you shall take. And taking sounds like you can use anything. It's, again, that word's extra. It tells you can take anything to pierce the ear. But then it says martzeya. Then it says specifically in all. That's a prat, that's a detail, that's a specification. So we first have a generalization, take anything. Then we have a specification, take a all. And then it says, bi'azno vadeles, or vinasato, it says, vinasata, and you should put it, bi'azno vadeles, you should put it in his ear and in the door. And that sounds, again, more general, and you should put it, but it doesn't specify anything, so that's a generalization again. So chazar b'kol, so it returned and generalized again. So what we have here is klal upratu klal. What we're dealing with is a generalization, followed by a specification, a detail, followed by another generalization. So what do you do in such a situation? So according to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi holds that in such a situation, the rule is that you judge it, you learn it out, that it has to be similar to the prat, similar to that specification. And maha prat mefurash shamateches, and just like that specification, which was an all, it is made of metal. Maha prat mefurash, just like the explicit detail is shamateches, is metal. Afkol shamateches. So too, whatever you use has to be made of metal. So this is a general opinion of how you approach drashos, how you derive from the Torah, that wherever you have a generalization followed by a specification, so what you understand is that the specification is coming to explain the generalization. And the generalization is limited to what is true about the detail, the specification. And when it then tells you to generalize afterwards, meaning, I guess if you just had a generalization, you'd say, okay, it could be anything. Then you have the detail, it says, oh, it has to be specifically this. But then it generalizes again, so actually it could be anything as long as it's ke'ain, as long as it's similar to the detail. So here, it could be anything as long as it's similar to the detail, which is the all, that it has to be made of metal. That's how Rebbe approaches this. But there's another way to approach drashos, and that's the approach that Rabbi Yossi takes. Rabbi Yossi darish ribuye umiuti. Rabbi Yossi understands that there's ribuye. Ribuye means increasing, coming to include more. And then there's miuti, which excludes, which limits. So there's increasing, and then there's limiting. Vilakachta riba. First, it says, and you shall take, it sounds like anything, that's riba, that's marba, that includes lots of things. Then there's martzeya, then it says specifically a martzeya, a all, that's mi'et, that limits it. And then it says, vinasata be'ozno badelas, it says you shall place it in his ear or in the door, and in the door, chazar veriba, and then it went back and included more. Riba umi'et veriba. So what we're dealing with is an increase followed by a decrease followed by an increase. What we do in that situation is riba hakol. It comes to include everything. And my Rabbi, what does it include? Rabbi kol mili. It includes everything. So it comes to include that you can use anything. The difference in this approach is that when you have a generalization followed by a detail, the detail isn't coming to define the generalization like it is according to Rebbe, to limit it, but rather as follows. That the generalization would include everything, and the limitation, the miut that comes afterwards, is coming to tell you that I guess at that point maybe it is coming to limit it, that it has to be similar to this, but then when it comes and generalizes a second time, so then it's riba hakol. Like I'm saying, actually everything's included. So what's the miut? So what's the detailed coming to tell you? That's coming to exclude something. It's coming to exclude one thing. That's how we look at it. The way that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda looks at it is that when you have a generalization followed by a limitation followed by a generalization, that it tells you include everything. So then what's the point of the limitation? That's coming to tell you to exclude one thing. And that's what the Gemara wants to know now. What's that one thing that's excluded? My mi'et, what is it excluding? Mi'et sam. It's excluding like poison or a chemical. That as he said, it has to be something that you hold in your hand. You have to use an implement, a tool, to poke the hole, but it could be any kind of tool, made of any material. But you cannot use this sam. You can't use poison or a chemical to make the hole in the ear, which happens on its own, without the use of your force, without a tool. That cannot be used. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that limitation is just coming to exclude one thing. Use anything, but we tell you specifically a martzeya, not to say that it has to be that, but to exclude something. What's it excluding? It's excluding sam. It's excluding the use of chemicals. Okay, so that's the machlokas. That's the dispute between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Okay, now we go back to the Brisa, and the Brisa said, we're on the first wide line towards the end, Amar Mar, the master said, Hamartzeya, that it's the all, Lahavi Martzeya Hagadol. That's to include the great Martzeya, the great, even a big all, or again, specifically a big all. My mashma, why does it imply that? Kedal Rava, it's similar to what Rava said. Rava said in the context of the Gid Anashe. The Gid Anashe is the sciatic nerve that's forbidden to eat. You're not allowed to eat from the sciatic nerve of an animal, but specifically from the right side of the animal, even though such a nerve exists on both sides, but you specifically, at least midaraisa, cannot eat from the one on the right side. Or at least according to Rava. I'm not sure how we rule practically, but according to Rava, hayarech it says. The pasuk says, Asher al kaf hayarech. That's on the ball of the thigh. So Rava says hayarech, the thigh. What's the thigh? Hamiyumenes shebiyerech. The more chashuv, the more significant one, the right side. That's the one that you can't eat from. So hachanami, so similar here. It says hamartzeya, the all. That it should be a specific kind of all, the big all. I don't know if there's like different, if there were different kinds, and we know, and they knew what this is referring to specifically. You have your set of alls, and there's the big one. Use the big one, or if it's just saying it should be a big one. But it seems that this opinion, the Brisa holds that you're supposed to use a big all, not a small one, because it says the all, the big one. Okay, then the Brisa said, Amar Rabbi Lazar said, Yudan Beribi Hayadarish. Yudan Beribi used to teach Kishing Rotzin and Rotzing Alba Milsa. That when you pierce the ear, it should be in the earlobe. The Chachamim said that can't be because Eng Eved Ivri Kohen Nirtza. Because we know that an Eved Ivri Kohen, a Kohen who becomes a Jewish slave, is not allowed to have his ear pierced and stay on longer. Because that makes him blemished. And if it was in the earlobe that we're making blemished, it must be the hole is higher up in the cartilage. Ask the Gemara, V'yase balmum, let him become a balmum, let him become blemished. So what? If he wants to, that's his prerogative. He can decide. Why can't he become a nirtza? Why can't we pierce his ear and blemish him? Amar Rabba Bar Rav Shila. So Rav Shila said, Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, V'shav el mishpachto. He should return to his family. At the end, when he's released at Yovel, he returns to his family. L'muchzak shebemishpachto. To the status of his family. Meaning he returns to his original status. That's the halacha. So we can't have him lose his status as a functioning Kohen by now having a blemish. He has to return to his status. And that's why he doesn't even have the choice to have his ear pierced, which would blemish him. Okay. Now that we're talking about Eved Ivri and Kohanim, we have a question. They asked them, Eved Ivri Kohen, a Jewish slave who happens to be a Kohen who becomes a slave. Is his master allowed to marry him to a Canaanite slave? There's a special halacha that normally a Jew cannot marry a Canaanite, a non-Jew, but when he is an Eved Ivri, when he's a Jewish slave, the master is allowed to actually marry him to a Canaanite maidservant. So what about a Kohen? Can a Kohen who's a Jewish slave marry a Canaanite maidservant? Chidushu. Do we say, the Torah said a Chiddush, it said a novel halacha that this can happen, and lo shna Kohanim, lo shna Yisrael. It doesn't make a difference if it's a Kohen or a Yisrael. Just like we say there's novelty by Yisrael, so too by a Kohen. Odilmor, maybe Shani Kohanim, maybe Kohanim are different. Since we find that they have additional commandments, additional restrictions, additional laws of tumah, additional laws of who they can marry, so maybe it doesn't apply to a Kohen, and a Kohen who's a Jewish slave may not be married to a Canaanite maidservant. That was the question. Rav Amar Mutter. Rav said it's permitted. The Kohen who's a slave could be married to a Canaanite maidservant. Shmuel Amar Aser. Shmuel says it's forbidden. Amar le Rav Nachman le Rav Anan. Rav Nachman said to Rav Anan, Ki avisu beimar Shmuel. When you were at the house of Shmuel, of our master Shmuel, and he said this, and he said that it's forbidden for a master to marry his slave, who's a Kohen, to a Canaanite maidservant, be'iskumadri itlalisu. You must have been playing with sticks, some kind of game, he says. You must have been playing games with sticks and not paying attention. Because why? Because my time alo temru meha. Because why wouldn't you have said to him the following? Why wouldn't you have answered Shmuel back? Shmuel, what are you talking about? The Chachamim Omrim, we just read in the Bryce of the following. The Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim say, Ein Eved Ivri Kohen Nirtza, that you can't have a Jewish slave who's a Nirtza, who has his ear pierced, Mibnei Shenaseh Bamlon, because that makes him blemished. That's what the Chachamim said. Ve'im Tomar, and if it was true, like Shmuel said, that Ein Rabo Moser Lo Shifcha Kananis, that the master is not allowed to marry him to a Shifcha Kananis, to a Canaanite maidservant, typically, then I have another reason why he can't be a Nirtza. Let me learn it from Diba'ina, because we require that in order for him to stay on, he has to say the following, and apparently they hold that it has to be true. Ahavtias Adoni es ishti besbanai. That the pasuk says that in the context of a slave who wants to remain under his master and get his ear pierced, that he says, I love my master, my wife, and my children. Meaning, if it was a regular wife, so what? He'd go free and be with your wife. It must be that he loves his Canaanite wife. So the Rav Nachman actually seems to be understanding that, and this may be true in halacha. This may be practically true. I'm not certain, but it seems that this is taking as a given. The Gemara doesn't refute it in any way. So this seems to be that in order for a slave to stay on past the 6 years, he can't just do it because he wants to. He has to actually be married to a Canaanite slave, maidservant, and say, I love my master and I love my Canaanite wife, and that's why I want to stay on. And if he doesn't, then he can't stay on. So if he's not married to a Canaanite woman, then he definitely can't stay on. So says Rav Nachman that what was Shmuel saying, that he's not allowed, that a Kohen can't be married to a Canaanite slave, a Canaanite maidservant? If that was true, then that would be a reason why he can never be a Nirtza. Because you can only be a Nirtza, you can only stay on longer if you were married to a Canaanite woman and you wanted to stay on longer. So why would the Mishnah have to say, why would the Chachamim have to say, or really they're quoting an opinion, but why would that opinion have to say that a Kohen can't be a Nirtza because it will blemish him? Forget about that. He can't be a Nirtza because he can never have been married to a Canaanite woman. And he can never say, I love my wife and I want to stay on. So says Rav Nachman, actually what we see is that it must be that he could be married to the Canaanite woman. So he said to Rav Anan, why didn't you respond this to Shmuel? When Shmuel said he can't, you should have responded this. And he says, it's such a good proof. It's such a good proof, he says. Visleka su lomidi, he says. There's nothing else to say. There's no response to this. So he says it's clear that Rav was correct, that a Kohen who's a slave is allowed to be married to a Canaanite maidservant. Okay, they asked another question about a Kohen. Kohen ma would be a fast toar. Is a Kohen allowed to marry a fast toar? Literally like a woman of beauty. But this is referring to a very specific parsha in the Torah. The Torah says at the beginning of Parshas Kiseitze, Kiseitze la melchama alevecho, when you go out to war on your enemy, and you see amongst the captives a beautiful woman, and you're overcome with desire, chashaktava, you have a great desire for her, you can take her as a wife to your home. So it's a special allotment, the Gemara will discuss it more, for a situation of war, where a person's desires are raised, and the Torah allows this, to marry this prisoner of war. But the question is a Kohen even allowed to do that? Kiddushin, do we say the Torah tar novel halacha that a soldier is allowed to marry this woman? Lo shna Kohen v'lo shna Yisrael. It doesn't make a difference if the soldier is a Kohen or a Yisrael. Even a Kohen could. O Dilma, or maybe Shani Kohanim. Maybe Kohanim are different. Hoel v'riba b'hem mitzvos yiseirus. The Torah taught many extra mitzvos for Kohanim. They have added restrictions, and maybe they are not allowed to marry a Yifas Toar, a beautiful woman captive. So Rav Amar Motor, Rav says it's permitted even for a Kohen. Ushmuel Amar Aser, Shmuel says it's forbidding. Says the Gemara, B'bio Rishona Dekuliyama Lo Pligi, Deshari. He says when it comes to the first bia, the first act of intercourse, so he says that everybody agrees is permitted even for a Kohen. That's not what they're arguing about, Rav and Shmuel. Why? Because the reason why the Torah allowed this act, this intercourse with this woman, is because the Torah understood a person's Yetzer Hara, a person's desires, and that it's extremely difficult to overcome in this situation. The Torah said Hashem said we have to allow this. I'll allow this here, at war, in this very specific scenario. So, both whether you're a Kohen or Yisrael, you have that Yetzer Hara. You have that inclination. And so in this, so with regards to the first bia, it makes sense. The Gemara says that everybody should agree that it's permitted even for a Kohen. Ki pligi. So in what situation is the argument of Rav and Shmuel about whether she's permitted to a Kohen? Ki pligi b'bia shniya. We're talking about subsequent intercourse, the second one, and anything after that. Can they continue to be together? Can the Kohen marry her or not? Rav Amar Motor, Shmuel Amar Aser. Rav said it's permitted, and Shmuel said it's forbidding. Rav Amar Motor, Rav said it's permitted because ho v'ishtarya ishtari. That once the Torah allowed this woman to be with the Kohen, so then she's permitted from here on out. Once it's mutter, it's permitted. Ushmuel Amar Aser. Shmuel says it's Aser. Why? Tahav Yola Gioris. Because this woman is a Gioris, she's a convert. V'Gioris l'Kohen lo chazya. And a Gioris, a convert, is not allowed to marry a Kohen. A Kohen is not allowed to marry a convert, and therefore he can't marry this woman. She's a convert, but she becomes a convert, but she's forbidden to a Kohen subsequently. That's Shmuel's opinion. So that's one way of looking at this. Ikka da'amri, but there are those who look at it differently. Ikka da'amri b'bia shniya kuliyamu lo pligi da'asira. There are those that actually, when it comes to the second act of intercourse and thereon out, everybody agrees it's forbidden to the Kohen. Dahavi Lagyaris, because she's a convert, and a convert is forbidden to a Kohen. Ki pligi b'bia rishoning. Actually, the dispute between Rav and Shmuel is on the first bia, the first act of intercourse. Rav Amar Mutter. Rav says it's permitted. Dahalo dibra Torah, Keneged Yetzer Hara. Like we said earlier, the Torah is speaking to one's Yetzer Hara. The Torah, Hashem understood that this was, or Hashem, I guess, created it, but made it that there's a very difficult test here. A person cannot overcome this. So at war, in this type of scenario, it's permitted for the man, for the soldier, to be with this woman. Ushmuel Amar Aser. And Rav saying it doesn't make a difference whether it's a Kohen or Yisrael. They both have that same Yetzer Hara. Ushmuel Amar Aser, but Shmuel says it's forbidden for the Kohen. Why? Because of the following. Kohecha dekarina be'va be'sal toch be'secha. Anywhere where it's relevant to read about that person, and he should take her to his house. That's what the pasuk says. He should take her to his house and marry her. Karina be'v v'ra'isa b'ashivya. That's where we say that if he sees amongst the captives a beautiful woman, he can be with her. But meaning if it's relevant to then marry her, that's where he can be with her in the first place. But But any situation where we don't apply the subsequent verse that he brings her to his house and marries her, so then lo karina be'ver isa b'shivya. We can't say about him, and he sees amongst the captives a beautiful woman, that he can be with her because he cannot subsequently marry her. That's the opinion of Shmuel in this version. In this version, everybody agrees that the second bia, the subsequent intercourse, will be forbidden for the Kohen because she's a gioris, she's a convert, and he's forbidden to a convert. And really based on that, that's why Shmuel would say, and therefore the first one's also forbidden, because since he can't subsequently marry her, he can't be with her in the first place. And Rav disagrees with that drasha, and Rav says actually he could be with her in the first place. It's relevant to him. This is because of a person's inclination, and it's permitted even for a Kohen. Just close with this brisa that just expounds on the laws of the Yifas Toar, of this beautiful captive. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, V'ra'isa b'ashivya, and you will see, the verse says, you will see amongst the captives. That this teaches me b'shas shivya. It has to be at the time of captivity, meaning it has to be that he saw her and desired to be with her at the time that she was a captive, and not that he took her to sell her as a slave or as a maidservant and then changed his mind. It has to be that he has this desire come over him at the time when she's first taken captive. It can't be subsequent to that. Subsequent to that, this doesn't apply. She would not be permitted to him. Eshes, a woman. That's beautiful, but Eshes means the wife of someone, really. So we learn about Fiula Eshes Ish. Even if she's married, then she's still permitted as a captive to the Jewish soldier. Even if she was married to a non-Jew, she's permitted in this situation. Yifas Toar, of beauty. Why does it tell us that she's beautiful? Why is that important? What it's telling us is that the reason is the Torah is speaking to the man's Yetzer Hara. The Torah understands the man's inclination while at war. And the Torah says, Mutav sheyochlu Yisrael basar tamusos shchutos val yochlu basar tamusos nevelos. It's better that the Jew eats meat, dead meat basically, that has been shechted, that has been slaughtered, and not dead meat that is nevela, that is unslaughtered, that is just a carcass. By dead meat we mean like dying meat, like bad meat. In other words, that's an analogy for that. This is not good meat. We don't want him to be with this woman. We don't want him to marry a non-Jewish captive. It's not the ideal wife for a nice Jewish boy. But the Torah recognizes his Yetzer Hara, and it says better that it be in a permitted way than it being a forbidden way. So it's like better that the meat be shechted than it not be shechted, right? So better that the Torah said will permit her rather than that because he's going to succumb to this desire, and so better the Torah says let's permit it. V'chashakta, the pasuk then continues and it says, and he desires her, afal pi she'eina na'eh, even if she's not beautiful. She doesn't have to. It's just that it depends. If he desires her, it's not an objective thing. It's subjective, I guess, and it would apply as long as he has a desire come over him. Ba, it says ba in her. V'lo ba v'chaverta. It's one, not two, not her and her friend. This is limited. This allowance is limited to one captive. V'lo kachta, and he will take her. Likuchen yesh l'chaba. That he takes her as a wife. That Kiddushin takes effect, even though she wasn't Jewish, but he's able to actually take her as a wife. And she goes through a process of conversion, but he's able to actually marry her, as opposed to in a normal situation, a non-Jew, you can't marry her until she converts. There's no Kiddushin, it just doesn't do anything. Leisha, as a wife. L'cha leisha, to you as a wife. Shelo yikach shtei nashim. You can't bring home two women. Achas lo v'achas la'aviv. One for him and one for his father. Achas lo v'achas livno, or one for him and one for his son. the soldier is allowed to only bring home a wife for him. He can't bring home a wife for someone else. V'habesa, and it says that he should bring her to his house. Melamed shelo yilchatzena b'milchama, which teaches me that he should not force himself on her at war while on the battlefield. He should bring her back to his house to marry her there. Okay, there's a discussion if she's actually permitted at the battlefield or not, but Rashi at least learns that he can't be Baal, he can't be with her on the battlefield. It has to be when he brings her back to his house. Okay, we will pick up from here next time.